Hi, my name is Jermaine Garth, also known as Officer Garth. I've been in Graceway for over 10 years, been with the security and video ministry for over a year, and here are some of the other ways you can be involved.
So sometimes you hear people talk about coffee with the pastors. What is that, and why should I care? Why should I be a part of that? Coffee with the Pastors is a time when we explain what it means to go beyond just attending Graceway and becoming a significant sharer in what God is doing here. And so it's a great time. It's a great time to find out what's going on and your part in that. And so I just encourage you, when you hear about the next Coffee with the Pastors, be there. Always on Sunday morning, always a chance to understand what's going on, ask questions, and determine what do I need to do to be a part of what God's doing here.
Hi, Graceway. Next Sunday, we'll be celebrating all of our graduations during the 11 o'clock service. If you graduated from high school, got your bachelor degree or above, we'd love to celebrate with you. If you're graduating from high school, please contact Kelly Cornley with the name of your high school, where you plan on going to college, and what you plan on doing for the next 10 years. If you've graduated with your bachelor degree or above, please contact Jeremy Shell with the name of your school and what your degree is in. Congratulations to all of our graduates.
Okay, so I'm supposed to describe the perfect mom.
The perfect mother. I would say she's about 5'8" and blonde hair, but she dyes it because it's brown now.
The best mother in the world? The one that doesn't nag at me to clean my room. The one that doesn't tell me to flush the toilet when I'm finished using the John. The one that doesn't tell me to wash my hands after using the John.
Mi mamá fue la mamá perfecta porque siempre me enseñó disciplina, me enseñó a ser consistente en todo lo que hacía y a hacer lo mejor que podía en todo.
My mom is perfect because she's a great person to just listen to and just to have me just talk. We just love talking.
Because she does all the cool stuff for me, like does the dishes and get me ready for school.
The perfect mom, her name is Julie. She is caring, compassionate, and lets me grow out my beard even though she doesn't like it, and still loves me in spite of my facial hair.
The perfect mom is Linda Castro.
My mom is the best mom because she showed me disciplined, and she loves me always, and she was there when I need her.
A mom that loves you and cares for you, and she pays for stuff.
My mom is perfect because she's always patient with me, and no matter what I do, she will always be there and support me. My dreams are crazy and I'm crazy, but in spite of all that, she will always love me. I love you, Mom. Happy Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's Day.
En un día como hoy recordamos a todas las madres deseando al Todopoderoso que Dios derrame sus bendiciones sobre cada una de ellas y que nosotros como hijos podamos ser para ellas una bendición. Dios bendiga a las madres el día de hoy.
Perfect mom would be a mom that bakes you perfect cookies every day. When I'm sad, she makes me happy. And she loves me. The perfect mom is my mom. She's sweet and she's sometimes cooked dinner for us. And she's nice to my dad, and I love my mommy.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to church. It's good to see you. My name is Jeff. I'm one of the pastors here. And I'm going to ask you to take your Bible and open it to Luke chapter 7, if you would. Luke chapter 7. as we continue going through the Gospel of Luke. We're going to begin this morning in verse 36, and really we're going to begin with two questions, all right? Two very basic questions. Number one, who do you need to forgive? In fact, this morning, what we're going to be talking about is the power of forgiveness, and we're going to see a woman who was forgiven by Jesus, and we're going to see what incredible transformation that made in her life. And forgiveness is something I think is very necessary. I think it's God's gift to help us navigate through a world of sin. We all offend, don't we? We all mess up. We all sin. And there's so many times in life where we do something, say something, we wish that we could take it back or do over. But there's no do-overs in life. And when you stop and realize that, I can't do it over, I can't go back in time, there's really only one viable option, and that is to forgive. And that's why forgiveness is so powerful. I think that unforgiveness is probably the greatest sin that we can commit against other people. Now here's question number two. Who do you need to accept? Who do you need to accept? Because the story that we're going to see this morning is also about how we often allow our prejudice, our pride, our self-centeredness to be a block for someone who desperately needs to be part of God's family. We're going to see this morning a self-righteous religious leader who, rather than encouraging people to be part of God's family, is keeping them away. Just a moment ago, Summer and Maria were talking about how there are people all around us that sometimes we are, because of our ignorance or because of our prejudice, we are intimidated from approaching them, even when they desperately want to be approached. We don't know how to do that. We don't understand what that means. And we're going to see an amazing example of that this morning. So let me give you some background that is going to be very important for you, because this is a story that I think if you've been around church for a while, if you've read the Bible through a time or two, you will be familiar with the story. But I really think that probably most of you here have never understood this story as it really is. Because if you don't understand the cultural context, you're going to miss what's really happening here. And that's what I want to share with you this morning. So let me begin to give you a little background here. The story is continuing. The story that we saw since Luke chapter 6. As far as we know, Jesus is still in the small village of Nain, where not long ago he raised a widow's son from dead. And this is right after Jesus has compared the lawyers and the Pharisees, the religious leaders of Israel at this time. He has compared some of them who were attacking him, and also John the Baptizer, and he's compared them to immature children who are never satisfied. And he makes the application very specifically to him and to John, because they were polar opposites. John was this wild man in the desert, and Jesus was this very sociable guy who went around eating and drinking wine with publicans, tax collectors, and sinners. And they criticized both of them. Neither one lived up to their expectations. So what we see in verse 36 is one of these Pharisees now invites Jesus to a formal meal in his home. And it will appear from what we're going to see in just a moment that he has a hidden agenda. He's setting Jesus up to be exposed and embarrassed because this Pharisee doesn't believe that he really is a prophet of God as he claims to be. The tables are soon to be turned. This is an amazing story. Look at verse 36. One of the Pharisees desired him, Jesus, that he would eat with him. And he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot, does it? But a lot is happening here that you just missed, by the way. I'll clue you in why I say that. Oh, by the way, there's also a prostitute in the story today. I hope that doesn't bother you. Now, she is not the main star of the story, but she certainly has a major role, and it's very clear that the story is not about whether this lady goes to heaven or hell. That's not even on the table. The story is clear that she's already met Jesus and been forgiven, But the religious leaders obviously don't even care. They are more concerned to embarrass and expose Jesus and to show how it's true that he really does eat and drink with sinners. Now, some of you are still, there's a prostitute in our story, and this is church on Mother's Day. I'm sorry, it just worked out that way, okay? Been going through the Gospel of Luke for a long time, and I'm not smart enough to plan ahead and go, oh, Mother's Day, we want to talk about prostitutes today. I'm really sorry, but I think the tables will be turned on you as well. There was a famous writer in the last century that I really admire. His name was C.S. Lewis. Many of you have read C.S. Lewis, and I want to read a quote that I found from him that I think is very fitting today. If anyone thinks that Christians regard sexual sin as the supreme vice, he is quite wrong. The sins of the flesh are bad, but they are the least bad of all sins. All the worst pleasures are purely spiritual. The pleasure of putting other people in the wrong, of bossing and patronizing and spoiling sport and backbiting, the pleasures of power, of hatred. For there are two things inside me. They are the animal self and the diabolical self. And the diabolical self is the worst of the two. That is why a cold, self-righteous prig who goes regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute. But of course, it's better to be neither. Oh, by the way, this unit of scripture that we're going to look at this morning is a fabulous work of poetry. It is complex, it is beautiful, it is layered, and the message is overwhelming. And so what I want to do is a little different today. I just want to tell you the story. I just want to walk you through the story. There's not point 1, point 2, point 3. I just want to walk you through this story as it may have occurred, as how the Bible tells us that it occurs, but the problem is you don't have the cultural background, many of you. Some of you do. Some of you come from a very similar culture, but I want to make sure we all understand it. So Jesus, according to verse 36, has been invited to a meal in the home of this Pharisee. Now, meals in this culture, as you've heard me say many times, and you'll undoubtedly hear me say it again, they're a huge deal. In this culture, to this day, to invite someone into your home for a meal is a gesture of friendship. It is opening your life, your home, your family. It's saying, I want to be your friend. And like all cultures, and we have many cultures represented here, there are social graces and rules that we expect to follow. Now, you need to understand that in the first century, in this particular area of the world, to be invited to the home of a Pharisee, a lay spiritual leader in Israel, someone highly respected in the community, would be a very formal occasion. There would be a precise ritual to follow. Now, understand that there are no tables and chairs as you or I in Western culture might imagine. Rather, there will be, for sure, some pillows, lots of them, perhaps some very low divans or sofas, and they will be arranged in U-shape, and there'll probably be enough room for about a dozen men or maybe a few more. It's just the way that it has always been done for a formal meal like this. Now, here's the problem that we have with understanding, and I just had someone in the first service say, thank you for explaining something to me that I've always read the Bible and couldn't understand this. When we think of a first century meal today in our culture, here's what we think of. Okay, Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, great piece of art. But as you can see, it's the picture of Jesus and his 12 disciples, and they're all sitting around a table with chairs, as you and I might do today. They're dressed a little differently. Okay, the decor is probably not what we would expect in 2013, but basically 13 guys sitting around a table with chairs. Now, that's what's in our mind. That's why we have a hard time understanding this passage. Here's the reality. I want you to look. Everybody is reclined on their left side. Their feet are to the back. They're lying on a very low divan around a table where food is served communal style. Everyone eats with the right hand, only the right hand, please. And it's just the way that it is done. This is the reality. This would have been the scene at the Last Supper, regardless of what Leonardo da Vinci thought. Okay, this is just the way it is. In fact, here's how a similar meal might be set today before the guest arrived. You can see that in the last several thousand years, this culture has not changed. All right, here's me just 2 or 3 years ago in Iraq. You can kind of see me. The picture's a little dark, but this is before we recline. This is at the beginning of the meal, and you can see again that this part of the world has really not changed a great deal since biblical times. I just want you to have that image in your mind, and that's the way that it would have been set up here. Now, here's what you don't understand. You read verse 36, okay, Jesus has been invited to a meal, and so he shows up at Simon's house, and he goes in and he sits down. Not exactly. Because even though the word that is translated sit down, Jesus sat down, that's a legitimate translation, our English translators translate it that way in order to contextualize it, because in Western culture, in England, where this version of the Bible was translated, nobody would have understood anything else except people sitting in chairs around a table. The word literally means to recline on your left side, so as to eat with your right hand, just like the picture that you saw. It literally means to recline. Now, this tension in the room is because of the social order that was expected. When people would arrive at the home, and I'll tell you some of the other things that went on, but the people who were, and first of all, men only to be sat at the table, okay? You never sat at the table, men and women together. It's just not done, even though there's a woman in the room, and I'll explain that in a second. But anyway, you come in, and Jesus would have been about 30 years of age at this time. So if he is not the youngest of the invited guests, he is without doubt one of the youngest. And according to protocol, he would have come in and he would have hung kind of around the back of the room, just kind of hanging out there until the host, Simon in this case, would have said, Jesus, would you please come? We have the place of honor set for you. Or would you please sit here or sit there? Whatever the situation would have been. It would have been very formal. Nobody would dare just kind of but Jesus walks in, sits down in the place of honor, and reclines. There's tension in this room. Why does he do that? Is he arrogant? Is he just too bold and brash? Why would he do that? Okay, we're going to think about that for just a second. I'll come back and we'll find the answer to that in just a second. Look in verse 37. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner. That is a polite way 400 years ago in English to say she's a prostitute. And everybody knows it. It's a small village. Everybody knows exactly who she is and what she is. A woman who was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat or sat for the meal in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster box of ointment and stood at his feet behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. Now, if the room is set up like Leonardo da Vinci imagined it, that would be pretty logistically difficult, wouldn't it? But if you understand how the room and the setting was, then you realize that standing behind Jesus, his feet are easily accessible, and what she does is very understandable. Now, something very important for you to understand. She's a prostitute, very clear. We'll get into some more reasons for that. But the story assumes, and you'll see this as well, that she has already heard Jesus and been forgiven by him. Now, it's very important that you understand that. In other words, her actions here are not done out of guilt or to gain forgiveness. She is worshiping Jesus for having forgiven her. Now stay with me. This will become clear. She has an alabaster box that she has brought. That's the way we translate that in English. And so again, we have these images in our mind that are not totally exactly the way that it happened, because we've seen all the church plays and dramas through the years. And at this time, the lady comes in and she has this beautiful, ornate alabaster box in her hands or something. No, this is actually an alabaster flask that hangs from her neck, because it was the most essential tool of the trade for a prostitute. Because in this flask, she has perfume that is used to sweeten the smell of her body and freshen the smell of her breath. Okay, are you with me? Very important in her profession. And so she has come that day with this alabaster flask, more accurately. That's not to say this is a wrong translation. It's not. It's just understand the culture. And she is going to use this on Jesus' feet. She's come prepared with this. Now don't miss this. She's prepared to waste it on Jesus because she no longer needs it. Okay, following along? She doesn't need it anymore. So she stands at his feet behind him. And again, you have to understand the culture and what's going on here. The house is open. You say, how did the prostitute get inside? The houses are open. And people come in, they mill around, and it would not be uncommon for a woman to come in from down the street because the lady of the house had ran out of onions or whatnot, and she's coming, she's got some, and people are coming, kids are coming in. Sometimes neighbors come in just out of curiosity for a formal meal like this to see who are the guests of honor, and they just kind of mill around. The men of distinction would be reclined on their left side around this U-shaped table, but the younger men would be sitting in back of them on low stools. They would be sitting erect, upright, and this is just the way that it was. And the women were there when they were in the room only to serve, or if they were just milling around like this. Nobody would have thought twice. Now, this is really important. We're a multicultural international church. Some of you who come from places in Africa or Latin America or Asia, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You have lived things like this. This is part of your culture even to this day. So honestly, it is harder for Americans and Europeans to understand the Bible than anybody, because our culture is so far removed from the culture of the Bible. It is much more like the majority of cultures in the world, even to this day. So we have to work a little bit harder to be able to figure these things out, and that's what we want to do today. So she is standing at his feet behind him. Feet were considered to be unclean. And they still are in many cultures. If you know somebody who is Asian, from Korea and Japan all the way across the Far East to India to Central Asia, feet are still considered to be unclean. If you invite someone like that to your home, chances are they're going to be taking their shoes off when they enter into your house. And if you go to visit their house, you might see shoes right outside the door or right inside the door, depending on the setup. And to this day, it is just considered feet are unclean. It is a huge deal. You don't want to bring the filth of the world into the house. That's the concept. Not a bad concept. Okay, but that's just the way that people think. So now she's weeping. She's washing his feet with tears. It was customary to wash the feet of a house guest, especially on a ceremonial occasion like this. But instead of using a basin of water, she uses her own tears. Now you should be asking yourself the question, why? Why is she doing that? Very important to walk through that. Think through it. Why? She's come prepared with this alabaster box. She's prepared with that. She no longer needs it because she's been forgiven. She's no longer going to be working as a prostitute. But she has no basin of water and she has no towel. So what she does next is absolutely unthinkable. Unthinkable. Maybe you have seen Muslim women at Walmart, Hy-Vee, your PTA meetings, picking up kids at school or from dance lessons or whatever, and you see the hijabs, you see perhaps sometimes there are ladies here in Kansas City that wear a full burqa. But in that culture today, it's very important in traditional culture to keep the head covered. Now, not all Muslim people follow those practices. That's less common today in the larger cities, but you get into the rural areas, every woman covers her head. And incidentally, not just Muslim. This has nothing to do with Islam. It has to do with Middle Eastern culture that goes all the way back to the days of Abraham and beyond. Read your Bible. Women are veiled. Women are covered. Even in New Testament times. That's what 1 Corinthians 11 is all about, where Paul talks about women being covered. And well, should I wear a hat or not to church? Nothing to do with that. This is a cultural thing. This is a cultural thing. Observed not just by Muslims, but by people who have traditional conservative values in that part of the world to this day. Now, you need to know something. In Jesus' day, in this particular culture, a woman typically would never let down her hair in the presence of a man until the night of her marriage behind closed bedroom doors. The very first time she would ever let down her hair would be on her wedding night to her husband. Sure hope you like my hair. It'll be the first time that he's seen it. So for this woman to let down her hair in the presence of these men would be considered erotic, totally inappropriate, provocative, totally unacceptable. In fact, one very scholarly commentator spoke into this passage, and he says, you need to understand this culture is so strong that what this woman does would be the equivalent today of going topless. Now, you can imagine the gasp that would come in the room if the lady just totally took her top off. Understand that at this time, in this culture, she's getting that same reaction. She has let her hair down in the presence of men, in public. None of them is her husband. The room is breathless. In verse 39, now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, the one bidden invited him, he's the host, he spoke within himself, saying, now he's not saying this out loud, he's saying this within himself, this man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that's touching him. For she's a sinner, she's a prostitute. Now that's why I say he's obviously got his own hidden agenda. Got him! If he really were a prophet, he would know who this woman was. Everybody else in the village knows who she is and what she does. And Jesus answering said unto him, I love that. He's speaking within himself, thinking that nobody hears. Jesus answers him because he is a prophet and so much more. So he answers him. And when he does, it's amazing what he says. Jesus answering said unto him, Simon, first time we see his name, I have somewhat to say unto thee. Now, in Middle Eastern culture, that is an idiomatic expression that you would use with somebody when you want to tell them something they don't want to hear. So Simon is like, uh-oh. I have somewhat to say unto you, Simon. And he says to Jesus, Master, literally teacher, scholar, it's a word of great distinction, say on. In other words, he's giving him permission to speak. Now this is important as well because he's recognizing that Jesus is a scholar, a teacher. He's worthy of respect. Okay, just keep that in mind because this is part of the setup. And poor Simon doesn't realize he's trapped. Now we'll see what happens here. So Jesus then speaks on and gives this parable in verses 41 to 43. There was a certain creditor which had two debtors. The one owed 500 pence, the other 50. When they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me therefore which of them will love him most. Simon answered and said, I suppose he to whom he forgave most. And he said unto him, you've rightly judged. Now this is the literary center of this whole passage. In other words, this is what it's about. This is not about the woman. This is about the right answer to this parable. That's what this is about. There's no question about that when you see this laid out in poetic form. This is the heart. This is the center. It's not about this woman, whether she's forgiven or not, whether she goes to heaven or hell. It's not about her. It's about the answer to this parable. And it says here, he frankly forgave them both. What's that word frankly mean? Now that's older English. We would say today totally, completely, freely. No strings attached at all. Now this is huge because you remember some time ago we were talking about how in this culture there's a lot of gift giving, but many times gift giving is also an obligation. When you give something to somebody, you're expecting them to return the favor, okay? The use of this word frankly means nothing is expected in return. In other words, this creditor is fully, totally, no strings attached, forgiving them, which means I accept them as my equal. They are equal to me. Now, put that in the back of your mind here. This is deeper than what you might think at first glance. It's more than just who loves more, and that's part of it. But it has to do with considering the forgiven person as an equal. It's possible to recognize that somebody's forgiven and still treat them with prejudice and bigotry. You following me? That's what's happening here. So all of a sudden, we're going to see this woman in a totally different light. We're looking at that, we're going, well, she's a prostitute. That's what everybody around the table is thinking too. That's the village prostitute. Everybody knows that. How dare she? She let her hair down? Oh, that just shows you what type of woman she is. Now, Simon has been set up. Verse 44, Jesus turns to the woman, and says unto Simon, this is huge, this is bold, this is dramatic. Nobody else is even wanting to look at her. They would prefer to ignore her and pretend that she is not there. You ever been in a situation like that? You don't know what to do, so you just ignore the person? You just don't even acknowledge them. Jesus turns to her and says to Simon, Simon, you see this woman? Ooh. Now, Jesus takes center stage. Jesus is going to challenge Simon's worldview and his interpretation of her actions. He and all the others around the table just assume that she is socially unacceptable. What she's done is erotic, distasteful, it's impure. When in reality, what is happening, this is an extravagant act of love and worship because she's been forgiven. I want to show you why. They're not only honorable, her actions, they are incredibly extravagant. So Simon, you see this woman? Now the truth is going to come out. There's very formal protocol for a formal meal like this. Look in verse 44. He turned to the woman, said unto Simon, see this woman? I entered into your house, you gave me no water for my feet. Uh-oh. But she's washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. You gave me no kiss. But this woman, since the time I came in, has not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil you did not anoint, but this woman has anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, Simon, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. Wow. All of a sudden we begin to realize what's going on here. Everybody has a protocol. We do in America, right? Let's say that your son is graduating from a small university here in the Kansas City area this month in May. And because it's a smaller university, you have gotten to know maybe even the college president or maybe one of his or her favorite professors. And so as a way to recognize this achievement, you invite that professor or that college president to your home for a meal. And that person accepts. Now, what would you think if here you are in your house and all of a sudden at the time that you had appointed and the distinguished guest is standing at the door? And all of a sudden from inside, it's open! You go in, there's nobody there. And you see a figure in the living room in a lazy boy recliner with a can of beer, watching television with the volume cranked up. There's no other word other than, "It's open!" So, college dignitary goes in, and this was the time. "Yeah, we'll eat in a bit. Find a place to sit." If you were that college professor or president, you would probably be thinking, "Oh, me. This is going to be a long night." You're thinking, why in the world did I accept this invitation? I mean, how rude would that be? What happens to Jesus here is worse. Let me explain why. The tension is not because of what happened, it's because of what did not happen. Jesus has been invited to a formal meal. Simon calls him a scholar. Simon twice is said to be the host, the one who did the inviting. It's his responsibility. When Jesus enters the house, every traditional courtesy is omitted. The cultural equivalent of saying, "It's open." There's no kiss of greeting. There is always a kiss of greeting in this culture. The host would go to the invited person, kiss them on each cheek, embrace them, bid them to come in. "Please be seated. Come in, come in, come in." And we're an international church. We got all these different cultures. Sometimes it confuses me. Can I be honest with you? Okay, in Latin America, we kiss and hug a lot. Although even we get confused sometimes, because in some countries you start on the right cheek, in some countries you start on the left cheek. Sometimes we meet in the middle and collide, okay? It's very, very confusing. And then we've got people, some of you people come from a European background or, kind of a traditional Anglo background. You're not huggy-feely type people. And so, you can't do that. And over the years, you just have to learn, okay, this is a hugger, this is not a hugger, this is a right cheek. And then I go to Europe and you go to Belgium or France, and it's 2 kisses in some countries, 3 in others, and sometimes you start on one side, sometimes it's very confusing. So if I offend you, I don't mean to. I'm just confused. I'll just tell you that up front, okay? We just do the best that we possibly can in this mix of cultures. But in this culture, you always, man to man, you kiss your guest who comes in. You always do it. Bible talks about greet each other with a holy kiss. What we're talking about here. Always, always, he comes in, nobody kisses him. Now, before they would recline for the meal, as I said earlier, they would stand around and they would sit on low stools around the table as water would be brought, typically by a servant with a basin of water and a towel over the arm. They would come and clean their feet in a ritual way. And then in almost every occasion, there's olive oil everywhere in this part of the world. Oil would be offered to wash hands and to anoint face, to just freshen up. This would be the bare minimum that you would expect if you were invited to this house, to say nothing of Jesus, who is recognized as a scholar, a teacher. And Jesus gets none of that. No one in that house, no one would have failed to observe that. No one. What is going on here? Jesus could very well have said, well, I can see that I'm not welcome here, and could have just walked out the door in a huff, and everybody there would have understood, like, well, I would have done the same thing. But instead, he very boldly goes to the place of honor and reclines. And there's a woman there. Jesus confirms in the story that is told that she's been in the room all the time since he entered. She has witnessed to this horrible insult that he has received. No one has welcomed him with a kiss, so she will kiss his feet. Only thing that she could do. She couldn't greet him as a man would greet him. There's no water to clean his feet. Everybody's ignoring her. She's a prostitute. She's still dressed like a prostitute. She hasn't had time or the resources to go and change her wardrobe. So nobody is going to think to give her a basin of water or a towel. After all, that would make them unclean. So she begins to weep and washes his feet with her tears. And there's no towel. So she does the unthinkable. She lets her hair down and dries his feet with her hair. And in all probability, this woman is weeping not because of guilt, but because her heart is broken over the way that her Savior is treated. She's heartsick. What have you people done? This is the man who forgave me. This is the man who gave me a new lease on life. And weeping, she begins to wash his feet with her tears. The story's not about her. We take this, well, is a woman going to heaven or hell? That's not even the issue. She's been to Jesus. She's been forgiven. It's not about her. It's about Jesus. It always is. No oil is provided for Jesus to even anoint himself, so this woman uses her own perfume as an offering poured out. Do you see what's happening here? This woman fulfills the role of host that Simon has so grossly violated. She knows her status socially. She knows that people look at her sideways and talk about her behind her back. She knows that. Simon has falsely judged this woman. It's pretty interesting what happens in verse 47. Wherefore, I say unto thee, unto Simon, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. Wow. All of a sudden, it becomes clear. That parable about being freely forgiven to accept someone on an equal basis, they won't even look at this woman, even though she's been forgiven by Jesus. Their prejudice, her past, their bias, all confirms to them she's not even worthy to be in the presence of any one of them. And Jesus is saying, no, she is every bit equal to any one of you. She's been forgiven. Wow. The reason for our outpouring of love, it confirms the truth of forgiveness. And so he confirms this to her in the presence of everyone else for their benefit. Verse 47, wherefore I say unto thee, her sins which are many are forgiven, she loves much, but to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And he said unto her, thy sins are forgiven. He's reminding her, they that sat at meat with him began to say within themselves, who is this that forgives sin also? And he says to the woman, your faith has saved thee, go in peace. Not her tears, not her sorrow, not her works. She's saved by faith, by grace through faith, just like you and me. You see, the point is not her individual forgiveness, which was already granted to her. The point here is her restoration to the community of God's people who are not willing to save her, or not willing, to accept her because of their prejudice and because of their self-centeredness. And I wonder how many times we also misjudge forgiven sinners. We tend to judge people by the way that they look, the way that they talk, and by their past. She's still dressed like a prostitute, undoubtedly. That was unacceptable to them. But you know what? We are the assembly of God's people. And when new people show up here, whether it's on a Sunday morning or to a small group, what do we do when somebody shows up that obviously is not like us? Now, I say that realizing that this is kind of an exception, this church, because nobody's like anybody else. We come from all over many different cultures and background, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Do we just ignore someone because they don't fit in? We've had women here in these services before with hijabs. You kind of stay away from somebody like that because you're not sure what to do, or maybe you're just prejudiced. Maybe you bought into the line, all Muslims just are on this jihad and they want to kill us all and slash our throat. You really ought to get out more. Do we just ignore that? Do we just pretend that they're not here? Do we prejudge them and talk about them rather than talk with them? Or do we patronize them, take them aside, and lovingly show them how to fit in? Which is probably about the worst thing that you could do. Or do we treat them with the respect and dignity that we ought to reserve for any human being? We're not good at that in church world. Do we treat them as equals and trust the Holy Spirit of God to lead them even as He led us, even if they never look like us or talk like us or act like us? Do we make people feel accepted and forgiven in God's presence and ours? You know, there's two types of sinners in this room: lawbreakers and law keepers. And they're both equally sinners. The Pharisee and his other guests are God's people. I want you to understand that these are not evil people. These are God's people. The day before Jesus shows up, they are God's representatives. They are God's people, loving and serving God. They believe the same scriptures that you and I believe, as literally and completely as we do. Let that sink in. They do. But their convictions, their traditions, their ideas, their comfort zone, and so much more have led them to overlook the most basic truth of all, that God forgives us of our sin. Wasn't it brilliant when Jesus was attacked by that attorney that wanted to trap him, wanted him to say what was the most important commandment? And Jesus, in two big rules, summarizes all the scriptures. He says, it's all about this: love God, love your neighbor. He said, that's everything. Why, that just bugs the tar out of us because we want to add stuff to that. Jesus said, no, let me summarize it for you. Love God, love your neighbor. We don't want to believe that. This woman's love for God is so deep, she provides her own tears to wash his feet. Kingdom people weep for God and they weep for others. They don't weep when they don't get their own way. Their faith in the scriptures was great. Their focus was on the fact that they were pure. I don't lie, I don't steal, don't commit adultery. We shouldn't do those things. But they don't have a clue what it means to love God and others. Indeed, it should be our love for God and for others that motivates us to obey God's truth. That's why I don't lie, steal, cheat, commit adultery. Because I love God and love his people. Not because I'm fearful that God's going to zap me and judge me. How do we see people? Do we see people through the eyes of God, or do we see them through the eyes of our own expectations? And I go back to the two questions I ask. Who do we need to forgive? Who do we need to accept? Maybe you might even want to start today. Just looking around you. And instead of stepping across people that you don't even want to acknowledge are there to get to your friend because you haven't seen them since last week, there might be somebody here today that's in a Christian church for the first time in their life. It happens more often than you would imagine. And many times, desperately hungry, they can't find someone to even speak to them. Maria talked about how her mom, 20 years in Canada before she made a single Canadian friend. There are people from around the world that shop with us and whose kids go to school with ours who have never had an American friend, never been in an American home. And some of them have been here for 10, 15, 20 years and more. Our mission is not to be comfortable in church. Our mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. Let's stand together and pray. Dear God,